Okay, so as is obvious now from the last 2 to 3 videos I've made, I got a little bit ahead of myself, which means instead of following the original plan of beginning with Plato and moving up and then covering the Old and New Testaments, followed by issues pertaining to the Trinity and the Christology of the Orthodox Church, everything kind of spilled out with my response to Father Jacob's article at Rush of Faith. So now that we're already sort of, now that we've kind of plunged into the ontological and metaphysical questions relative to the Trinity and the Christology of the Church, we'll go ahead and continue, I think, in that same vein. Please make sure you listen to the last one I did. It only has 9 views so far, and I think that's because I made it like in the evening before liturgy, and most of the followers here that I have are still from my Orthodox days. But if you want to be able to follow the logic of this video, you're going to have to watch that one, and make sure you see also the one before that. Actually, there's 2 before that. The one where I first respond to Father Jacob's, and then I get a little further in my second shorter video, the 5-minute video, talking about causation within the Holy Trinity, and how in the world can you reconcile the causation of two persons by one person within the Trinity with the idea that the 3 persons are simultaneously co-eternal and co-equal. So this will be similar, only we're going to be focusing on the Logos in particular and on the dogma of the hypostatic union. And in the same way that we enumerated 4 options that the Orthodox could go with if they don't want to maintain the contradiction within the Trinity of having the Father causing the other 2 persons, there are also 4 options they could go with here to overcome the contradiction of the hypostatic union. And first I'm going to explain why it is a contradiction. And then, of course, we'll go into detail on the other 4 options, the remaining 4 options. But here's an interesting problem that the Church created for itself. When the Church in the 6th century decided that they needed to officially condemn the doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul, of course, what they did, and I'm not sure that I don't think they really contemplated the implications of it, but what they did was to preclude the existence of Jesus' soul prior to his body. So Jesus, not only in his physical body, but Jesus' very soul never existed until the Holy Ghost conceived of him within the Virgin Mary, according to the Creed, right? So we have a man who is, in that respect, no different from you or I, in that his physical body, his soul, his mind, and his heart came into existence in a point in time by the normal human means of generation, excepting, of course, sexuality. That was not a component. So what we have here then really are 2 different subjects that we're having to reconcile within the doctrine of the hypostatic union. You have the Logos, of course, the divine Logos, the second member of the Holy Trinity, and then over here you have Jesus, soul and body and mind, right? And spirit, who is a completely new thing, a completely new being. And how do we reconcile this so that he is a God-man, 100% God and 100% man, fully God and fully man, as they argue from, and as we see in the worked out in the dogma of Chalcedon in the 5th century? How is that possible? We have to understand, we have to take them at their word. We have to take them literally when they say that Jesus was fully God and fully man. That means Jesus was 100% God, 100% divine, and simultaneously 100% human. Now, of course, they're going to nuance it, and we'll get into that a little bit, but at face value, it's a contradiction. You can't say that the flesh of Jesus is 100% divine. Otherwise, he's no longer human. He's unique. He's set apart from us, and in no way can he be likened unto us, which defeats the whole purpose of Orthodox soteriology. You also can't say that the divine logos is human. That would be completely absurd. That would make no sense at all. Then he'd no longer be divine at all. He would just be a creature. And so, yeah, so let me just get into it. I've got my notes here. Let me get into the various options that we have. So they've got this first option, which is that you can argue that the humanity of Jesus was eternal and divine. And you can nuance that. You can nuance that by saying that his humanity was eternal in the sense that, like Revelation talks about, I can think it's Revelation 13, where it refers to Jesus being the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. So they're in that sense, the cross was eternal, right? Which means that the incarnation was eternal. The humanity of Jesus was eternal in that sense, and that it was always part of God's eternal plan. But my existence and your existence was also part of God's eternal plan. So in that sense, our flesh is just as eternal as Jesus' flesh on that logic. Now you could argue, and as Sergei Bulgakov did, who is typically just vilified as a heretic by most Orthodox Christians. He was a Russian Orthodox priest in the early 20th century, very famous theologian whose work is still being evaluated, but mostly in Russia. But Bulgakov said that there is a sense in which his humanity was eternal, and that the church, God's bride, was eternal as a result, because you can't have the incarnation, an eternal incarnation, without having an eternal bride, right? Jesus and the church go together. Well, once you say that, now you're saying that there is a divine feminine aspect to God, which is to say, which is the divine Sophia, I guess you could call her. That's what he called her, and he got condemned for teaching this. That there was a feminine aspect to the divine. That there was both a masculine and a feminine sort of dimension to God's eternal being. So you could take that option, but of course they don't want that option. It's not one that they're willing to that most of them are willing to entertain. So they don't want to say that the humanity is really in any sense eternal in that regard. And then, of course, the option I mentioned earlier, which is, of course, absurd. Nobody wants to take this view. It wouldn't make any sense. The idea that the divinity, you could just flip that first option around and say, instead of the humanity is eternal and divine, you could say that the divinity or the eternal logos is somehow created and human. For obvious reasons, that's not an option. The third option would be to take a position similar, pretty much the adoptionist view, and to say that the divine logos attached itself to Jesus' human nature, which of course would be the heresy that the church condemned early on, adoptionism, the heresy of adoptionism, which one variation on that is Apollinarianism, where Apollinarius came along and decided that Jesus had to have a divine mind in order for that link, that common link, to exist between the human nature and the divine nature. And of course, he was condemned for that. So you've got that third option, adoptionism. You could also take a fourth view and say that Jesus is a composite or a mixture of the two, human and divine, which of course was condemned by the church as the doctrine of monophysitism or monophysitism, I don't know where you want to put that accent or that emphasis. I always go back and forth on that. But Obviously, that's not an option. So we're left with the fifth option, which is what we started with, which is the position that the church holds, that Jesus is literally 100% God and 100% man. Now, they also rejected the doctrine of patripassianism, the idea that the Father could die, or that the divine nature in any sense could die. So they had to nuance their understanding of the crucifixion by saying that the God-man died in the sense that the subject, taken as a whole, died on the cross. There's a link somehow between the divine and the human, and so when Jesus' body was seen to die, then we would say that the God-man died, without arguing that the divine nature died in some sense, right? In other words, they don't want to isolate the divine nature from the humanity and say that the divine nature died, so we would say that the God-man died when the flesh expired on the cross. But then when you do that, you can no longer take the literal view. You can't say that the humanity, that the flesh is literally 100% divine. So now you got to have some distinction. But now when you create that distinction, you got to recognize that, well, now we're back actually to adoptionism. Unless you want to argue for the pre-existence of Jesus' soul, but you can't do that because the church, as I mentioned just earlier in the video, condemned the doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul, which would have to apply to Jesus himself. Obviously, as a result, Jesus' soul could not have pre-existed. So now you have two subjects. You've got the Logos, and then you've got the humanity of Jesus. You've got Jesus himself. Excuse me. You've got Jesus himself, body, soul, spirit, mind, right? That really only leaves a variation on adoptionism or Nestorianism. So where do you go from here? I don't know. I don't know where they go from here, other than to just continue repeating over and over, regurgitating the idea from Chalcedon that he is 100% God and 100% man. So now what you could do is you could go full circle back to option number one and say that acknowledge that the humanity is in some sense eternal and divine, like Bulgakov does. Excuse me, I've got terrible allergies and my postnasal drip is just making me interrupt myself over and over. You can take the Bulgakov view and say that the humanity is eternal, that the humanity is divine in some sense, and therefore the church is eternal and divine, the body of Christ. And so then you have to admit of Bulgakov's divine Sophia, which is perfectly fine with me because that was the position I defended in the first place when I responded to Father Jacobs. So, but once you do that, now you have to understand it in a universal sense. It's no longer possible to see Jesus' humanity or to see the manifestation of God in material terms as taking on a unique manifestation in the flesh of a particular man. Now you're in dharmic territory. You have to understand that God is manifest in everything. He's manifest in the cosmos. He's manifest in souls. He's manifest in the various divine forms that he takes. So you can no longer on that view of things have a sectarian soteriology and claim that there is a unique community which has access to this special truth over here that nobody else has access to. If the means to union and reunion with God, to self-realization, is, as we've been defending, mysticism and not some forensic scheme of salvation, then we have that direct connection to God. You don't need a mediator in the forensic sense. You don't need a death. You don't need a sacrifice. So I think I've exhausted it. Hopefully I didn't go through this too quickly. If anyone needs clarification on something, I'm happy to follow this up with another video and try to clarify anything that wasn't perfectly apparent to the listeners. But that's in a nutshell the issue, and I'm gonna sign off here and start working on the next video.